Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. Welcome back to the show. Oh my goodness, what an interview. This author, her name is Carol Sanford, and she is remarkable. She's just nudging 80, and she has a huge body of work behind her. She's got 5 really powerful books that are required reading at Stanford and Harvard. For 40 years, she's worked with organizational teams of Fortune 500 companies to realize their inherent capabilities. She's contrarian, and in our conversation, we take a huge, big picture, meta look at some of the practices that we have as leaders, like giving feedback, which apparently we shouldn't do, which makes me think, oh my goodness, I have to rewrite all my books. But if you're up for it, this episode will shift and move your way of thinking about yourself and leadership in a way that you haven't heard before on this podcast and perhaps ever. So yeah, game changing. Okay, let's get into it. Carol Sanford, all the way from Mill Creek, just outside of Seattle. Woo, that's a long way away from where I am. Welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We did have a couple of hiccups getting onto the show, as usual, technology, yada, yada, yada. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have this conversation with you because I got a copy of your latest book, The Regenerative Life, and I cast my eye over and went, holy cow, this is some original thought. I haven't seen, it's not a rehash. Often you read leadership books and they're rehash. This is new, innovative, quite different. And the whole suite of your books, I suspect, because I haven't read them all, is along the same vein. So thrilled to have you here. Let's start with a big question. Well, maybe it's an easy question. I'm not sure. So you say that, everything you do is the regenerative something. What is the regenerative concept all about?
Well, the regenerative concept is not mine. It's ancient. And so it literally means to help things evolve according to their essence, where it's going. So instead of deciding a child how it should be from some standardized way, that child is itself and on its way to something. Our job is to help awaken that and help evolve. But also the core idea is it's always in a larger context. It's not that child for themselves, but for the system of which they're a part, a role they can play, a contribution. So regeneration is always about helping any life form. This could also be a life shed. I don't call them watersheds. That's a long story. But a life shed is unique on its way to being something. And our job is not to restore it to our image, but to ensure it can be what it uniquely can be in the place on the planet it exists doing its work.
Okay, so let me paraphrase to make sure I've got that.
Great. Come back at me.
So, let's do compare contrast, perhaps, as the starting point. So what it's not is, I'm a parent, I'm going to raise this kid the way that I think it should be raised. That is not regenerative work.
Nope, that's something else.
That's something else. Directing, imposing, projecting. So a regenerative approach to a life form like a child or an employee is looking at that entity in its situation and helping it thrive in its own context. Is that an accurate paraphrase?
There's a subtlety that people may not get that I want to add to what you said. It's not us determining what its essence is, but it determining and us following its lead. That's the subtlety that makes it regenerative, because the parents isn't looking and saying, I think they could be so-and-so, or the worst case you were hinting at, they should be so-and-so. It is, what is it seeking to be? I could give you an example. Would that help?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. I have a 10-year-old granddaughter who I love to tell stories about. One day she came in to the room where I had just bought a huge box of scarves and necklaces and hats, and she had wrapped things around her in a way that were exquisitely beautiful. I mean, she looked like a dancer of some kind. She was about 6. And I said, wow, would you like to be able to design your own clothes? And she lit up. And ever since then, she has been designing and explicitly bringing forward the aesthetic of a dinner table, a room like where I just moved, clothing she puts on, or a hat she thinks I could wear.
Okay.
So it's her essence. I'm following her lead.
Oh, I see. So if we put this into a business context with a leader and their employees, what does this look like on a very pragmatic interpersonal experience?
That's a great question. I always start with kids because we all were one. So there's a good chance we can get the idea. But when I go into a company, we do an essence reveal of the founder, like Jeffrey Hollander, who founded a now mid-sized company owned by Unilever in the United States, 7th generation. We discovered that his essence, that is what he'd been pursuing all of his life, was the ability to expose dissonance, where people say one thing and do another, and he will annoy the hell out of you because he'll call you out on you said you were going to do something, like he did this to Walmart. Lee Cox, you guys said you were going to take care of the planet, and here you are with more packaging thrown away than enters with the materials because of the shipping containers. And he wrote large blogs explaining how Walmart was saying one thing and doing another. He also had a core to his essence of transparency. Now, what does that do for you when you look at his business, which was your question? Transparency, we took into being able to print a label, not required by law or anything else, that explained all ingredients. We wrote the first report that said, here's what our year has been like, here's how much damage we think we did to the planet, to customers, to not achieving what we said. So again, their own dissonance, pointing out to themselves. And people loved it because they didn't feel like they were being lied to. We wrote a corporate direction for them, which was to be the authentic voice for sustainability and customer realization. Now, every product we designed was based on that. Every packaging design was based on that. The people we hired were based on, and I say we because I own stock and I was so invested in them for years with the education process. But essence, my granddaughter is easy to see because it's one child, but you can do it with the whole business. I did it with DuPont and discovered their essence is managing risk. It caused them to sell businesses, redesign many things because they felt like they didn't know how to manage the risk on them, and create more product offerings, like started selling their safety programs. So it's not a kind of flaky, weird idea. It's a very practical money-making idea. The companies that do this grow their revenue, and this is in print. Each of these people I just mentioned have said we grew their revenue in the first 5 years 35 to 65% annually. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of revenue growth? That comes from the connecting with regenerative sense of essence.
So you talked about 2 examples there. One was doing an essence reveal of the founder, another one of the company as a whole. These are nested concepts or related concepts?
Yeah, we did the essence reveal of the founder of DuPont, E.I. DuPont. E.I. DuPont himself came to the U.S. escaping the revolution in France, and what he did there was manage explosives. He came here, built a dynamite factory, and all of it he did in a way that he had his own house. The walls of his house were a shared wall with the factory to guarantee that he and everyone else was thinking about the safety of what they were doing. No one had ever done that with ballistics or explosives. So it was the founding. The essence always is at the founding, and sometimes there are multiple founders. Now, you have people who tend to be attracted to that forever. the way you do it in a interview is Jeffrey Hollander would share with a group of potential new hires, and someone different, not Chad Holliday and DuPont, would share this essence and say, what does that have to do with why you applied to come here? And they would glow and speak eloquently about that's exactly what had attracted them. So the other thing is, if you discover it, make it explicit, work with it, you will attract people who have compatible essences and want to work on the same thing. And then, of course, in the book, we talked about how that's true in every role. Parent role has an essence, designer role is really a simple way of saying is it's learning to find what the core of that work is and staying centered and focused rather than being scattered.
So when it's the core of the work, is this different to values then or principles? Is it a different word for those things or is it a different concept?
No, it's not a different word for those things. Core is what something is. Principles have to do with how you're going to work on things. They're guidelines for behavior doing that core. And values also are another thing, but they're the kind of thing that speak to what is the value we're producing and what is it we're causing to happen. And so therefore it's saying that's what we value, whether we know it or not. There are a constellation of things that all get confused, and we don't have time here today to talk about those, but they make up a system or a constellation. But the center, the like lead horse or lead sled dog, is the essence of the core of what that business is about that drives everything, no matter who the leader is, no matter the era, no matter the industry. It will be the keystone idea.
And does it change over time, or is that the mistake that businesses make?
Oh, I love that you said that. In the Western world particularly, but we've made everything in the Western world now, we tend to impose on a country. So if a colonizing effect happens, that country tends to become very westernized. And we tend to want to put our idea. So a new leader, one retires, a new one comes in. That new leader wants to bring their idea, their stamp, and what they do often, and why a company will not do well in a transition, is the ego is too big of the leader. So now we're back to your field, right? The leadership issue of what people are doing. If you don't look at what this business is independent of you, and as Jeffrey says, this business was waiting to happen before I founded it. And as Chad Holliday said, who was president 200 years after E.I. DuPont, he said it's always been this. It's not about who's in the seat with the president title. It's about what the business was created for. Everyone, if they stay with that, and when they leave it, they get in trouble. When they stay with it, they do amazing things. They lead industries and they make a lot of money.
I'm also curious now with that whole idea of essence. Some of the research shows that we don't have companies that last for hundreds of years anymore, and the life cycle of a business is a lot shorter. If this notion of essence is true, how do you explain that? Is it the whole idea that new leaders come in and they're trying to impose their own concept? They don't honor the essence of the origins?
Most people don't even know about the idea, and we are so driven to be individualistic that we have a very hard time even building on somebody we love's thought. So we will want our marriage to be the way we want the marriage to be, and the partner wants the marriage to be the way they want it to be. We want a child to be the way we want the child to be. Our own arrogance and hubris are always imposed the minute we have a little bit of power. And companies that do last, you may have noticed that in particularly Japan, is where some of the longest lasting companies are. There are 400 and 500-year-old companies there. And that is because they have less of a culture that's individualistic. Like Canon is 300 and something. I've forgotten. Can't remember his name now, the current president, or maybe he's just left. He said, "This is not mine, it is mine to tend during my reign." And he said, "I do reign, because people will listen to me, but it's not mine. I am paying attention to hand it off for another 300 and whatever years it is. So it really is the hubris and the arrogance of the person who wants their stamp to be on it. And we all have a lot of that if we don't learn to manage it.
Oh, yeah. I think it's part of the earlier parts of leadership growth is to come to terms and manage that sense of power.
How do you do that?
I'm
really curious. How do you do that? I'll tell you how I do it, but because you said that, I really agree with you. What's important to you in learning to manage that?
A lot of it is, and I've explored this in my last book, People Stuff. It's about the lens of perspective and the trap of, as you named it, the hubris piece, which comes along, which is the trap of power. So as we rise to power, our gaze moves from being of service to others to gaze on self, because we realize how energizing power is, how exhilarating it is to wield it. And if we're not careful, we start to become concerned or obsessed about maintaining that energizing factor. So the circuit breaker is like, hang on a minute. Where is my focus right now? Is it on me, aggrandizing me, or is it in service to the people who originally put me into this place of power? So that's the circuit breaker there for me.
I love that. I call it having stop exercises. Circuit breaker is a similar idea. And I'm an educator. Like, I don't have programs I show them, but I educate them about how to learn to observe themselves and set aims so that they're working against an aim which is in service of something rather than just accomplishment and success for that person. And that self-observing is kind of I love the name circuit breaker. It's like, shut everything down, right? Don't let it run away. Yep.
Yeah, that self-observation skill, it's an advanced emotional intelligence piece. The ability to take a third-person perspective on self is what helps people shift. It's not a third-person perspective, you don't think?
I don't think that's what self-observing is.
Okay.
I think that self-observing is an ancient idea, and I'm not a fan of emotional intelligence. I think it has co-opted ideas and made them partial. So what I am seeking to get people to do is third person makes it appear or another person rather than looking at a nested system of effects. And so for me, I'm learning to observe how every thought I had is going to lead to an effect, not from someone else's perspective, but from the greater whole of which we're part. Like, what happens to democracy? If I engage with you in a particular way, what does that produce in democracy? So, for example, if I agree with you because I want you to love me, which of course I do, but if that's what I do, I may not have the power to notice how I'm interpreting the other person's perspective, and I can cloud it if I put another person in. So I tell people, don't use the idea. It's more like a third eye in the old ancient practices, but it's more like asking, if democracy could speak to us, what would she say? If Earth could speak to us, what would she say? So the part that I agree with you said it's perspective, but I think for me it's important to avoid having another person in there.
So that probably leads as a nice segue into your contrarian view of ditching feedback.
Yeah.
You have a whole book on that, right? No More Feedback is the book title.
I do.
Tell me about this. What's going on with this concept?
When I was doing my doctoral work, I did a little project that changed my life. And it was to try and understand if you could change, in this case, 9-year-old boys who were compulsive liars into being able to tell the truth. We had mothers and teachers who were in agony. So I did this little project where we asked them to do a certain very brief exercise. It was basically put your hands in a certain position on the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the end, with the first group, we asked them, how did you do? Did you get it right? And they, yes. They lied like crazy. And we said, well, we videotaped you. We're going to show you, and then you talk to us. They all looked at the videotape and said, no, we were perfect. We said, okay, we're going to do it again. And this time they started watching each other. Now they're cheating, right? We've driven them to cheating. And then at the end, we asked them how they did, and they said, we were better. Well, I'll tell you, you can't do this. This is an illegal exercise to do in research now. I'm old enough, they hadn't figured out we shouldn't be doing that, and we undid it. The second group, the minute the video, and I wasn't visible, we were all hidden. I asked the second group, how did you do on the exercise? Of course, they did perfect, but I said, if you would like to do it better next time, what would you do? And first, they were a little startled. No one ever give them a second chance. They were either right or wrong the first time. And I said, well, come up with one idea. And they said, well, we go slower. So we counted slower. And sure enough, they did better. How'd you do? We did better. How would you do it better next time? Let's use that mirror. We were in a ballet studio. So they lined up, instead of being in a circle, used the mirror and could see each other. Fourth time, how could you do it better? They made it harder. What we discovered when we went back to the first group and did exactly the same thing, they quickly moved into improving, evolving, telling themselves the truth because no one else was judging them. No one else was evaluating them. And we took that into the school district, which was in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and taught teachers how to work with giving children self-evaluation. And it was a revolutionary idea, but it turned everything in a way that kids were not defending and deepening their lying and cheating and stealing. Then in the book, I write about my own experience when I was my first teaching job. I was being evaluated on feedback, and it all had to do with somebody else's standard about what we were all supposed to look like. None of it had to do with who I was. And I realized that I wasn't going to survive the university system, so I left. And I developed all sorts of ways to help bosses, leaders, teachers, parents learn how it is you work in a developmental process where everything is intrinsically determined, not external. That's what that whole book is about.
Okay. Wow, that's pretty powerful. It sounds like a coaching approach, essentially.
Well, no, because coaching's still outside. It's so different that's what people always do. It must be mentor. Nope, you never give them ideas. Zero ideas, which is what coaches do. Instead, you educate them in frameworks how to observe themselves. So with the boys, what we did, we didn't have frameworks at that time, but we were asking them to look at three things and do self-assessing and then get better over time with no coach, with them being resources to one another and only an educator teaching them how to assess themselves. So we get rid of the coach model, the mentor model, all of those which still have an external source and make it all intrinsic.
So in gifting, I'm just thinking about the kids now. So there's still this transmission of these are the things that you need to look at if you're going to improve peace.
No, that's not what you say to them. That's the old model.
Yeah.
Here's some standards and things you look at. It's hard, isn't it? Yeah, the mind wants to go there. No, it is, here's a framework that you can form some questions. So what we did is gave them, you're trying to activate some things, you're restrained by others, you're trying to reconcile some. What is the question you would ask yourself to see what you're driven by, what it is you're restrained and having trouble by, and what would make you want to change it? And I've got hundreds of frameworks we teach people which have no answers in them, like here's what you're supposed to look like. Here's how you form questions to learn to see yourself. So people get really good at developing their own questions.
It's a meta skill. In other words,
it's a meta skill. Exactly. And of course, this book, The Regenerative Life, I call meta roles. They're roles that are at another level that you are being a resource or a coach or a mentor to yourself, not someone else.
Okay. So actually, I'm curious about the distinction between your books. So I'm not sure if these are in the correct chronological order: Responsible Entrepreneurs, Responsible Business, Regenerative Business, No More Feedback, Regenerative Life. Is that the chronological order of them?
Not quite, but I can tell you what the difference is, and we'll do a little of the... So the Responsible Business was my first book, and that was about ecosystems for companies, how it is you take all the stakeholders who are involved and actually build a healthy, vital ecosystem among them all. And each of these books are based on case stories, so they're like 15 13 stories of how to do it. My small businesses, entrepreneurs said, wait, all that book is for big companies. You've got DuPont and P&G, and where are we? So I wrote the entrepreneur book. All right, here's how you can do the thinking. And that one I wrote about people who change the course of their industry by using this kind of thinking. And so I have 13 stories. I also tell some big famous people how Steve Jobs and Oprah Winfrey were entrepreneurial. Then the third one is people say, well, that's great. Could you give it a little more how to do this? How do you go from these old line companies where old ideas to a new way? And I said, all right, I wrote the regenerative business, switched publishers, was able to change the way I was naming and describing, and laid out a path through a set of phases on how to do the first two. And then in chapter 5 of the regenerative business, I wrote 30 toxic practices. Things that are toxic to a company that are popular, like coaching, mentoring, visioning, feedback, performance reviews, hierarchies. I took 30 of the 105 toxic practices and wrote one chapter on what to do instead. And then I took one of those 30 and wrote my first book on the 30, No More Feedback. And then everybody said, wait, you keep writing for companies. What about us individuals who don't lead a department or lead a company? So I wrote a book for individuals you could do in any role, The Regenerative Life, because the principles are the regenerative something, as I said earlier, are the same, but it's not easy. Because it is a paradigm shift, just like you keep saying, well, you mean it's like, I say, no. And it's not because you're stupid. My goodness, you're one of the smartest people around. I can see it from your writing and listening to your podcast. You're like all of us, though. We're immersed in a paradigm, which is the machine and behavioral view, is that we have to have external people and processes and competencies and standards and behaviors all listed out for us, so we can't get there. So that's the 5. And the new one will be out in November called Indirect Work. And it is what underlies all of the theory of change that I work with and how to make it faster, deeper, and more effective if you're a change agent.
So Carol, this is like paradigm shattering, this work that you're doing.
That's my intention. That's my life work. I studied with Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of the Scientific Revolution and wrote about, I studied with him at Berkeley when he was a guest lecturer.
Wow. So can we just take a little, I want to have a biographical conversation now. Like, this is powerful work. It's paradigm shattering, and it's obviously a huge calling for you. How did you get to this place? So you talked about one of the life-changing moments was that experiment that you ran with the boys. That was a piece of work to that. Were there any other pivotal moments that brought you to this point where you're in this mission?
My father locked me in closets for punishment because I wasn't racist enough.
Oh, my God.
He was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan. And I was 4 and 5 years old when he started that. And I was not being conditioned well because I am, as my grandfather said, who was the other effect in my life, my paternal grandfather, who was half Mohawk and had been raised in an indigenous way of living. I was with those two on a daily basis when I was very young. The contrast was overwhelming. And although I'm terribly claustrophobic from being punished in closets, I became a fairly reflective person because you either go crazy or you learn to use the time. And somehow I was gifted with learning to use it. Well, not somehow. My grandfather would ask me questions, and he would teach me not to hate my father in the same way my father was trying to teach me to hate anyone with the dark-colored skin. That was such a living experience to have a grandfather who did nothing but ask me questions. He never told me what to do, never taught me to hate, never even told me what to believe and think, but he gave me a way of understanding the world that in the regenerative life, I tell that story. So by the time I got to Berkeley in the middle of the free speech movement, the war in Vietnam, and also I studied with David Bohm's students who had been there, who was the physicist who created a lot of what we kind of all know about quantum theory now. I had a series of teachers that were all radically different in the way they taught. None of them tried to make me something. They encouraged me to discover, to dig deep, to not accept anything on the surface. And I went through a lot of pain through all of that. But I also am so grateful that I had those, and they were all men. That's still startling to me. My mother was mentally ill, so spent a lot of time trying to make sure she was okay. But by the time I left school, and I met another man who was one of the founders of Procter & Gamble, who had figured out how to apply his thinking to business, I could see the things I'm saying to you ran through what he did, and it ran through what my grandfather had said. And I felt like I stepped from the road of how to be a sane human being to the person of how to make a difference. And that's how I got to here.
Oh my God, what a story. I might switch over to you because I'm metabolizing the experience of you right now.
Well, all of us have a story, and mine have some very disruptive pieces to them that most people don't get. But I think that the most important thing was that I kept along the way being asked powerful questions by people around me and allowed to find my own answers. And when I listened to anyone else's words, like my grandfather would say, never accept any words on face value from another person. Examine them as though they have a story. They got to them by some means. They have a paradigm. They have a lineage. How did they get to that idea? You need to know that, not just what they said, because if you don't examine it, you will be borrowing ideas that are unexamined and untested, and you're passing them along without any intelligence added to it.
That is good sage advice, that's for sure. At the beginning of this interview, before we pressed record, you said you'd want to ask me a couple questions, so go for it.
Well, one of them I did ask you as we were going along. I'm very curious about what you think this. I listened to a few of your podcasts and getting ready to see what you're like. And I kept thinking, I read what you wrote on what, and I've forgotten what the words were now, but what is the most important thing for your audience, for you, to get out of you taking the time and bringing people together? What are you really hoping to make happen?
From a meta point of view, I guess the big picture for the podcast is to expand perspective. That's the overarching reach of my work, is to help people see more, experience more complexity, more nuance.
How did you get to that idea? Why does that matter to you? So what?
Because I think ultimately when we can see more, experience more, we can lead with better wisdom and compassion. So the difference that each person wants to make will be from a more loving and compassionate point of view.
So I give you something to contrast it to and see what you do, and then love to hear a reflection. I talk about 4 levels of way that to me are how I think about the way emotion enters. I don't like the idea of emotional intelligence because it makes it sound like it's a separate intelligence, but I talk about that there is at the minimum level something called kindness, which all of us hope, because below that, is the evil do harm. So there's kindness. The second level is empathy, where now I not am just kind to you, man of the street, person who's in my home, but I can feel, I've been there and can feel what you feel. And so I will step into an empathetic position. If I care enough that I want to help you not be in the pain you're in, I call it compassion, where now we seek to do something. And I could hear that, in fact, you talked about compassion in a couple of the guests you talked to. I say that regeneration adds a 4th level. All of these are important, but the 4th one is caring in the ancient Greek sense, the caring of which you want to give people the capacity to do what they can do for themselves. And that doesn't mean without compassion or without empathy or kindness, but it means you don't always do for them, that you bring in the capability they need to do something. Where does that fit for you in the kind of work you do with leaders and particularly with the idea of emotional intelligence and compassion.
That principle, regenerative, in terms of helping people do what they can do or want to do and be able to do, is exactly what my work is all about. So it's about empowering leaders to step into the difference that they want to make, not the one that I think that they can, and helping them discover for themselves their own, well, I guess it's essence, but I never used that word before, and what they want to be in service to. So I'm an enabler in some ways.
Yeah, and enabler is a good word because to me, regeneration is about ableness. And ableness means something deeper than skill. And I thought I could hear that in your work. So those were the questions that I found myself wanting to ask you. Thank you for indulging me.
Oh, no, that's lovely. I don't often get to sit with a wise human like you and be asked probing questions, which is delightful. When you do essence work, is that process unpacked across all your books or in one in particular? Or
it's not unpacked anywhere because it can't be. It's something it takes years to learn to do because we can't get ourselves out of the way. If people are in my change agent groups over time, they learn to do that because it's called essence thinking. It's like you have to learn to see the core of anything you want to think about. Otherwise, you're fragmented and generic and automatic and bringing out all the trash. So you won't find a word about it in any of my books or on any of my podcasts because it is a change in being. It's a change in paradigm. And you have to unlearn so much before you can do that. So if that's the thing that hooks anybody about this, they should join one of my European or Deep Pacific or America's groups where over time we learn to be the nature of being that can let that work show up with us and other people.
Is there a meditative practice that allows us to access that? And you said it was a thinking process.
Well, it's a reflective process, and there's certainly a meditative nature to it, but it really is using living system frameworks. It's learning to see everything alive because we see things as dead or as things. We see a watershed as a thing and we got to go restore it. And we see an employee as a thing. We've got to get to match certain things. We have to move them and give them feedback and modify their behavior to get them to be. We have to unlearn all of that. And we have to unlearn that. For me, when I'm learning to see the essence, like let's say the essence of a tax system, you have a tax system, I have a tax system. What is the essence of a taxing agency? I think that if we really look at it, it's not about fairness and getting everybody to give a certain amount of money. It's about becoming wealth generating and teaching every human to be wealth generating. What if our taxing agencies saw that as the essence of their work? And it took me probably 10 years to figure out, oh, yeah, that's what really the taxing is about. It's about structuring in a way it manipulates how wealth gets created. Right now, we do a terrible job of that, and we create all the side effects. But if we thought about the essence of taxing, the essence of governing with money as wealth generating for everyone, we'd have a whole different set of work. It takes a while to learn to get to those kind of ideas, and you can do the same thing with social justice. What's the essence of the prison system? Right now, it's to keep people locked up until they die, right? It's not really about giving them capacity to be able to transform their work in society and only make that mistake once. If that was the essence of the prison and social justice system, we'd have a very different way of thinking. So see, it's about a way of thinking and going to what it is that it is designed to create, but has fallen into a misunderstanding of how it should work.
Wow. Those are two massive ideas to finish the interview on. What is our tax system?
Yeah.
And what is social justice all about and prison reform, which is perfect because there's people listening to the show who will latch onto that and will process it and move with it, which is fantastic. Carol, is there a message that you'd like to leave for our listeners at this point?
Yeah, don't try and figure out what the takeaway is out of today. Everybody said, well, one thing could they go do? Don't go do anything. And the reason is that we do with the old mind, with the old paradigm, and pull out something we kind of recognize and already know how to do. So instead, join with anything today you didn't understand, anything you can't figure out, and want to work on yourself on it. Work on you, not on trying to borrow, adapt, or tweet anything I had as a tool.
Okay. I love it. Yeah. Sit in the murkiness of the unknown and let it process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Carol, thank you so much. That was just amazing. And I would love to spend way more time engaging with you. So I really appreciate you and all that you are and everything that you're bringing to the world.
Well, the same to you, Zoe. I really love this conversation. Thank you for bringing me on.
What an extraordinary woman. I just so love this conversation. And I think the takeaway for me is not to do anything, but to sit with the stuff that's pushing the limits of your thinking. That's certainly what it's doing for me. And I remember when one of my mentors, Matt Church, said, if you can identify the skills or the insights that somebody else has got, and you can watch them and hear and listen to them, and you say, yep, got that, then you're just acknowledging what you know already inside of yourself. But it's the stuff that you can't quite put your finger on that feels a little bit slippery, then that's the stuff that you're kind of nudging your consciousness towards. And I think this conversation with Carol was a little bit like that. It kind of like, I haven't quite got the concepts. My brain is still wrapping myself around it. And then you know you're on the edge of development. And what an exciting place to be. This woman was extraordinary. If I have half her energy at her age, she's nearly 80 or over 80, then things are going really well. Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Her work is extraordinary. I encourage you to pick up some of her books and let your brain wrestle with them a little bit. If you like this episode, feel free to rate and review and promote it and share it and do all that good karma stuff. It really does help the show, and I really do appreciate it a lot. And if you just want to sing out and say g'day, how was my Australian accent with that? Just email me at zoe@zoerouth.com, or you can catch me on Twitter, that's the new social media platform, on Twitter at Zoe Routh, or on LinkedIn at Zoe Routh. Okay, I look forward to hearing you and oh my goodness, whew. I look forward to hearing from you and learning about you, and I'm so grateful for your listenership. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.